The man who opened the door in the little town of Sweet Home, Oregon, on a wet October morning in 2004 was 71 years old, and he had been waiting for that knock for 34 years. Special Agent Marlon Crowder of the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division stood on the warped pine boards of the porch with his partner, Special Agent Bethany Voss, and a manila folder tucked under his left arm. The folder was thin. It had been thin for a very long time. Inside it were 3 after-action reports, a casualty list with 12 names typed in faded carbon ink, a black-and-white photograph of a CH-47 Chinook helicopter resting on its left side against a stand of bamboo, and a single page from a 1971 investigation summary on which the bottom 4 paragraphs had been redacted with a felt-tip pen so heavy that the ink had bled through to the back of the paper. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment and tell us. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel with a subscription. The man in the doorway wore a gray flannel shirt and corduroy trousers, and a pair of slippers that had been mended at the heel with electrical tape. His hair was white. His left shoulder rode about an inch lower than his right, the way an old brake sets when nobody resets it properly. He smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and wood smoke and something else, something underneath, that Crowder had encountered before in the houses of men who drank alone. Crowder said his name. He said the name of the agency he worked for. He said the name on the door of the house, the name the man had been using for 3 decades. And then he said the other name, the real name. Curtis Eldon Weems, Chief Warrant Officer, United States Army, retired, formerly of the 179th Assault Support Helicopter Company, Camp Evans, Republic of Vietnam. The old man looked at him. He did not look surprised. He did not look frightened. He looked, Voss would later write in her notes, like a man who had been holding his breath since 1970 and had just been given permission to exhale. He said one sentence. He said, "You boys are about 30 years late, but I always knew somebody would come, and there is nothing on this earth that is going to make me say the rest of it out loud." Then he closed the door. They heard the deadbolt turn. They heard footsteps move away down a wooden hallway. They did not hear them come back. The Chinook had been found in the spring of 1970. The bones inside it had been left where they fell because the war was still on, and because the slope was bad, and because the Army, in those years, was losing men faster than it could carry them home. The names on the casualty list had been notified. The flags had been folded. The mothers had been told their sons died in a helicopter accident in Thua Thien Province during the monsoon season, and that there had been one survivor, the pilot, and that he had walked out 4 kilometers through the jungle with a broken collarbone and dehydration, and a story that, when typed up and signed and stamped, made sense from beginning to end. It made sense for 34 years. In the autumn of 2004, a joint POWMIA Accounting Command recovery team returned to the slope in what was now the Socialist Republic of Vietnam to bring the bones home. They expected to find 12 sets of remains inside the wreckage of the helicopter. They found 11. The 12th set of remains was located 100 meters down the slope from the fuselage. The skull had a single entry wound in the occipital bone, low and slightly to the left, consistent, the forensic anthropologist wrote, with a round fired from above and behind at close range. The bullet itself was recovered from the loam beneath the skeleton. It was a .45 caliber automatic Colt pistol round, standard issue in 1970 for United States Army officers' sidearm. Chief Warrant Officer Curtis Weems had carried a Colt 1911 on the day his Chinook went down. That pistol had never been recovered. Not on his person when the rescue Huey picked him up. Not in the wreckage. Not anywhere on the 4-kilometer line he claimed to have walked. Special Agent Crowder stood on the porch in Sweet Home for another 40 seconds after the door closed. Then he turned to Voss and said very quietly, "He's not going to talk. Not today. Maybe not ever." He was right about today. He was wrong about ever. Camp Evans, Thua Thien Province, the Republic of Vietnam, the second week of the southwest monsoon, 1970. The rain had been falling for 9 days without stopping, and the laterite mud on the helipad had the consistency of wet concrete, and the whole base smelled like jet fuel and mildew, and the cigarettes the men chain-smoked to keep the smell of everything else out of their nostrils. The 12 men of 2nd Platoon, Fox Company, of a battalion of the 25th Infantry Division were waiting under the corrugated tin overhang of a supply hooch with their rucks at their feet and their rifles across their knees, and their poncho liners draped over their shoulders against the rain that blew sideways under the eaves. They had been in country for periods ranging from 3 weeks to 10 months. 2 of them were on their second tour. One of them, the platoon's senior NCO, Staff Sergeant Roy Thibodeau of Lafayette Parish, Louisiana, was on his third. Thibodeau was 31 years old. He was the oldest man in the platoon by 6 years. He had a wife named Leona and 2 younger brothers who had not been drafted because he had volunteered twice in their place. He kept her letters in a Ziploc bag inside his helmet liner. He read them when he could not sleep, which was most nights. Next to him on the wooden ammunition crate that served as a bench sat Specialist Glenn Hargrove, 22, of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the platoon's radio telephone operator. Hargrove was thin and pale and quiet, and read paperback westerns by Louis L'Amour with the covers torn off so they would fit inside his cargo pocket. He had been in country for 4 months. He was due to rotate home in 8 months and 3 days, and he counted them every morning the way other men prayed. The other 10 men were a cross-section of the draft and of America in 1970. There was Private First Class Dale Murchison of Beaumont, Texas, who could fix any engine ever made and who had a fiancée named Roxanne. There was Corporal Wendell Paris of Flint, Michigan, who had played left tackle for his high school football team. There was Specialist Boyd Kettering of Reading, Pennsylvania, who carried a Zippo lighter engraved with the words, "When I die, I'll go to heaven because I've spent my time in hell." There was Private First Class Lucian Bohren, Sergeant Kurt Ostrander, Specialist Marlon Petrie, Private First Class Hollis Gant, Corporal Eldon Quist, Private First Class Truett Ammons, and the platoon's medic, a quiet Mormon kid from Provo named Specialist Renton Yarber, who did not smoke and did not drink and did not curse, and who, the rest of the platoon agreed, was the best damn medic any of them had ever served with. They were waiting for a CH-47 Chinook helicopter to take them out to a fire support base designated Lima Zulu, which sat on a ridgeline about 38 kilometers to the southwest, in country that the maps marked as elevation 712 meters, and that the men who had been there marked, in their own private maps, as the place where Bravo Company had lost 9 men to a mortar attack 3 weeks earlier, and where, on a clear day, you could hear the artillery from the A. Shaw Valley like distant thunder. Armed Forces Radio was playing through a transistor someone had hung from a nail. The song was "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival, and Thibodeau was not listening to it because he had heard it 400 times, and because he was watching, across the helipad, a man in a flight suit walking toward the operations hooch with the slow, careful gait of a man whose knees were already gone at 28 years old. That man was Chief Warrant Officer Curtis Weems. Weems was the pilot of the Chinook that was going to fly them to Lima Zulu. He was 28 years old and from Bakersfield, California, and he had been flying Chinooks in country for 14 months. He had a reputation among the other pilots of the 179th for being quiet, methodical, and rigid in a way that the older warrant officers approved of, and the younger ones found unsettling. He did not drink in the officers' club. He did not play poker. He went to the chapel on Sundays when his flight schedule permitted. He kept his flight log neater than any pilot in the company, and the maintenance officer, Captain Dury Falgu, had once said of him in the mess hall that Weems was the only pilot he knew who would ground his own aircraft for a single loose rivet and not give a damn whose mission it screwed up. Thibodeau had flown with Weems twice before. He liked him, Or at least he trusted him, which in 1970 were close enough to the same thing that the difference did not matter. But that morning, watching Weems walk across the helipad in the rain, Thibodeau noticed something that he did not have a word for, and that he would not, in the 4 hours of life remaining to him, find one. Weems was walking strangely, not limping, not favoring anything. He was walking the way a man walks when he is trying very hard not to be noticed. And Roy Thibodeau, who had survived 3 tours in part because he noticed things, sat up a little straighter on the ammunition crate and watched the pilot disappear into the operations hooch, and did not, for a reason he could not have explained, like what he had just seen. He turned to Hargrove and said, "You ever flown with Weems before?" Hargrove looked up from his paperback. He said, "Once. Why?" Thibodeau did not answer. The rain kept falling. The pre-flight inspection of a CH-47B Chinook helicopter, conducted properly, takes between 35 and 50 minutes. Chief Warrant Officer Curtis Weems completed his that morning in 19. His co-pilot, First Lieutenant Dale Murchison, no relation to the rifleman of the same surname in Fox Company, the coincidence was one of the small grim ironies of the war, noticed the haste but did not comment on it. Murchison was 24 years old, from Charleston, South Carolina, and on his 3rd month in country. He had 210 flight hours in the Chinook airframe. Weems had 1,900. When Weems told him the aircraft was ready, Murchison wrote down the numbers Weems gave him and signed the form, and did not ask why the forward transmission inspection panel had been opened and closed without, that he had observed, anybody actually looking inside it. The aircraft was a CH-47B, tail number 89143267. The actual serial blocks of that company's airframes are partially missing from the unit records, and the number given here is the one that appears in the surviving fragment of the morning flight schedule for that day, on a page that has been water damaged along its lower edge. It carried 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and 2 door gunners in the crew compartment. The flight engineer was Sergeant First Class Onslow Brubaker. The door gunners were Specialists Verl Hocking and Pell Stanky. None of them, in the years that followed, would survive to give a statement about anything that happened that morning, because none of them would survive the morning at all. The rotors began to turn at 10:47 local time. Down on the helipad, Thibodeau led his platoon out from under the supply hooch overhang and into the rain. They walked single file, hunched against the rotor wash, their rucks held by the carrying handles in their left hands and their rifles in their right. They climbed the ramp at the rear of the Chinook one by one. Hargrove went up 6th. Thibodeau went up last, as a platoon sergeant always does, and as he turned to take his seat on the red nylon webbing along the starboard wall of the cargo bay, he glanced forward through the open passageway to the flight deck, and he saw something that he filed away in the part of his mind where he kept things he did not have time to think about right now. He saw Curtis Weems in the right seat of the cockpit with his flight gloves off, checking the action on his Colt 1911 pistol. This was not in itself unusual. Pilots in 1970 carried sidearms, and the cockpit was as good a place as any to make sure the weapon was clear and the magazine was seated. What was unusual was that Weems checked it twice. He racked the slide. He let the slide forward. He removed the magazine. He looked at the top round. He reseated the magazine. He racked the slide again. Then he holstered the weapon and put his gloves back on and reached for the cyclic. Thibodeau took his seat and buckled in. The ramp came up. The whine of the twin Lycoming T-55 engines climbed through the registers, and the airframe began to vibrate, and the smell of JP-4 jet fuel filled the cargo bay the way it always did. And Specialist Boyd Kettering, sitting opposite Thibodeau, rolled his eyes and made the gesture he always made on takeoff, which was to cross himself, although he was not Catholic and never had been. The Chinook lifted off the pad at 10:51. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Murchison put his hand on the radio panel to call the tower with their departure time. Curtis Weems put his hand over Murchison's. Murchison looked at him. Weems said, "I've got the radios, Dale." His voice, Murchison would have testified, if he had lived to testify, was perfectly level. There was nothing wrong with the words. There was nothing wrong with the tone. There was something wrong with the eyes. But Murchison was 24 years old, and he had 210 hours in type, and he was sitting next to a chief warrant officer with 1,900. And so he took his hand off the radio panel, and he watched the cyclic, and he did not, in the 11 minutes of life remaining to him, say another word. The Chinook climbed to 1,500 feet and turned southwest and crossed the perimeter wire of Camp Evans and disappeared into the low ceiling over the Annamite foothills. The tower at Camp Evans logged its departure. The tower never logged a position report. There is a particular sound that the forward transmission of a CH-47B Chinook makes when it begins to fail. It is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is a low harmonic whine, slightly out of phase with the main rotor frequency, that any flight engineer with more than 1,000 hours in the airframe will recognize the way a mother recognizes her own child crying in a crowded room. Sergeant First Class Onslow Brubaker, in the jump seat behind the pilots, had 4,200 hours. He heard it at minute 6. The Chinook was at 1,500 feet above ground level, indicated airspeed 120 knots, on a heading of 235 degrees magnetic, in light rain and broken cloud over a stretch of triple canopy jungle that had no road, no trail, no village, and no friendly position within 12 kilometers in any direction. The terrain below was the kind that pilots in country called the Green Sea. It looked, from altitude, like a single unbroken mat of vegetation. It was not. It was 1,000 ravines and 1,000 ridgelines and 1,000 places where a helicopter could go down and never be found. Brubaker keyed his intercom and said, "Mr. Weems, forward transmission." "You hearing that?" Weems said. "I hear it." Brubaker said, "Sir, recommend we declare and turn for Camp Eagle. They've got a longer pad and a maintenance debt." Weems said, "Negative. We're going to Lima Zulu." There was a pause on the intercom of perhaps 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Onslow Brubaker, who had a wife in San Antonio and a daughter at Texas A&M, and a mortgage and a Buick Electra and 4,200 hours of flight time, understood something. And what he understood was that the man in the right seat of the aircraft he was riding in had no intention of landing this helicopter at Lima Zulu, or at Camp Eagle, or at any other place where the forward transmission could be inspected by anyone other than himself. Brubaker keyed his intercom again. He said, "Sir, with respect, I am going to log that recommendation." Weems said, "Log whatever you want, Sergeant. I have the aircraft." In the cargo bay, 20 feet aft of the cockpit, Roy Thibodeau could not hear the intercom, but he could feel the airframe, and he had ridden in enough Chinooks to know that the vibration coming up through the deck plates under his boots was wrong. He looked across the bay at Glenn Hargrove. Hargrove was reading his paperback. Thibodeau leaned forward and tapped Hargrove on the knee and pointed at the deck and made a face. Hargrove closed the book and put it in his cargo pocket and put his hand flat on the deck and felt what Thibodeau was feeling, and his face changed. Hargrove had been an aviation mechanic in his civilian life before the draft. He had worked at the Cedar Rapids Municipal Airport on Cessnas and Pipers, and once, for a summer, on an old Sikorsky S-58 that a crop dusting outfit had bought surplus and run into the ground inside 2 seasons. He knew what a transmission sounded like when it was about to come apart. He looked at Thibodeau. Thibodeau said over the noise, "How bad?" Hargrove said, "Bad." Thibodeau unbuckled. He stood up. He started forward toward the passageway between the cargo bay and the flight deck. He did not get there. What happened next happened in approximately 11 seconds, and the men who survived to argue about it later. There was, in the end, only one man who survived to argue about it, and he never argued about it at all. Would never agree on the order of events. The forward transmission seized. The aircraft yawed violently to the right. The number 1 engine, deprived of its load, oversped and threw a turbine blade through its own casing, and a piece of that blade severed the hydraulic line to the aft rotor head. The Chinook began to descend. It did not fall. A Chinook with a seized forward transmission does not fall. It auto-rotates badly, and it comes down at a rate of descent that is survivable if the pilot is good and lucky and the terrain is flat. The terrain below the aircraft on the morning in question was not flat. Thibodeau was thrown against the forward bulkhead. The lights in the cargo bay flickered and went out. Somebody screamed. The medic, Yarber, was praying in a voice loud enough to be heard over the engines. Hargrove was on the deck, holding on to a tie-down ring with both hands, and he looked forward through the passageway, and what he saw in the cockpit in the half-second before the aircraft hit the trees would be the last thing he ever saw clearly. He saw Curtis Weems take his hands off the controls. The Chinook came down through the upper canopy at an angle of approximately 22 degrees nose down and rolled 15 degrees to the right, and the first thing the trees took was the forward rotor head, which sheared off cleanly and disappeared into the foliage and was never found. The second thing the trees took was the number 1 engine. The third thing was the forward landing gear. By the time the fuselage itself came to rest on the slope of an unnamed ridge at an elevation of approximately 640 meters, the aircraft was lying on its left side. The aft rotor was still turning at reduced RPM, and the cargo bay was full of smoke and of the high, acrid chemical stink of hydraulic fluid burning on a hot manifold. Curtis Weems came to in the right seat of the cockpit 30 seconds after impact. He was hanging in his harness. The instrument panel was 3 feet from his face, and there was blood on it. But the blood was not his. The blood was Lieutenant Dale Murchison's, who was in the left seat, and who was dead, and who had been dead since the moment a piece of the forward transmission casing came through the cockpit floor and into the back of his seat. Weems hung in the harness for another 15 seconds. He was not at that point panicking. He was not, in any clinical sense, in shock. He was thinking. What he was thinking, he never told anyone. But the actions he took in the next 4 minutes have been reconstructed, as far as they can be reconstructed, from the physical evidence recovered in 1970 and again in 2004, and from one piece of testimony that nobody at the time understood to be testimony. The piece of testimony was a single sentence Curtis Weems said to a chaplain at the 185th Evacuation Hospital at Camp Eagle 2 days after the crash, while he was being treated for dehydration and a closed fracture of the right clavicle. The chaplain was Captain Garvin Whitaker, a Methodist from Topeka, Kansas, and he wrote the sentence down in his personal journal that night because it bothered him, and he kept that journal until his death in 2001, when it was donated, along with the rest of his papers, to the archives of a small Methodist seminary in Missouri. The sentence was this. Weems said, "Father, if a man knows a thing is going to break, and he does not stop it from breaking, is he the one who broke it?" Whitaker wrote in the margin of the journal entry, "He would not look at me when he said this." What Curtis Weems did in the 4 minutes after the crash, as best as the evidence allows it to be reconstructed, was this. He unbuckled himself from the harness. He climbed down out of the cockpit. He went aft into the cargo bay. He found that of the 12 men of Fox Company who had boarded the aircraft, 8 were dead of impact trauma, and 4 were alive but injured. He found that of the 3 crewmen in the cargo area, all 3 were dead. He found that the medic, Specialist Renton Yarber, was one of the 4 still living, and that Yarber, despite a compound fracture of the right femur, was already crawling toward Staff Sergeant Roy Thibodeau, who was unconscious but breathing, with a pressure dressing in his hand. And Curtis Weems found that Specialist Glenn Hargrove was sitting up against the starboard bulkhead of the cargo bay, conscious, with a gash across his forehead and his right arm clearly broken in 2 places, looking at him. Hargrove was looking at him the way a man looks at another man when he has just understood something he was not supposed to understand. He said, "You knew." Weems did not answer. Hargrove said again, louder, "You knew. The transmission. You knew before we lifted off." Weems looked at him. He looked at the 4 living men in the cargo bay. He looked at the medic, Yarber, who was now working on Thibodeau and had not yet looked up. He looked at the rear ramp of the Chinook, which had been blown partway open by the impact and which let in a wedge of gray monsoon light and a smell of crushed vegetation. Then he reached down, and he drew his Colt 1911 from the holster on his right hip. He did not point it at anyone. Not yet. He held it at his side. He said, "Hargrove, listen to me." But Glenn Hargrove, 22 years old, of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who had 8 months and 3 days to go on his tour, did not listen. He pushed himself up from the bulkhead with his good arm, and he stumbled, and he fell, and he crawled, and he got to the half-open ramp, and he went over the lip of it and out into the wet green light of the slope, and he began to slide and roll and scramble down the mountain. He made it 100 meters before Curtis Weems came out onto the ramp behind him. What happened in the next 90 seconds has no witnesses. The medic, Yarber, was inside the fuselage working on Thibodeau. The other 2 living men in the cargo bay, Corporal Wendell Paris and Private First Class Hollis Gant, were drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss, and would, within the next 2 hours, drift out and not back. Roy Thibodeau himself never regained consciousness. He died at approximately 14:30 hours from internal hemorrhaging, despite Yarber's efforts, and Yarber died beside him at approximately 17:20 hours from shock and from his own untreated femur fracture, with Thibodeau's hand still in his. The only living human being who knew what happened in that 90 seconds on that slope, from approximately 11:04 to approximately 11:06 on a wet morning in the monsoon season of 1970, was the man who was, 34 years later, going to close a door in Sweet Home, Oregon, and turn a deadbolt and walk away down a wooden hallway and not come back. There is a redacted section of the original investigation file, dated 1971, that runs from the bottom of page 3 through the top of page 7. The pages in between are missing entirely from the file as it exists in the archives today. The cover sheet of the file notes only that pages 4 through 6 were removed pursuant to a classification review, the date of which is, itself, illegible. What survives in the file is the following. Page 3 ends with a description of the wreckage as found by the recovery team that reached the site 48 hours after the crash. The recovery team was a combined element of an aviation maintenance detachment and a Graves registration squad, inserted by 2 Hueys onto a hastily cleared LZ approximately 600 meters downslope from the wreckage. The team leader was Captain Glenn Halsey, a 34-year-old maintenance officer from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, on his second tour. Halsey had been pulled into the recovery because his unit had been the parent maintenance command for the 179th Chinooks, and somebody at brigade had decided he should sign off on the mechanical findings. Halsey's preliminary report, which is what occupies the bottom half of page 3, notes the following findings. The forward transmission had catastrophically failed in flight. The number 1 engine had thrown a turbine blade. The aft rotor hydraulic line had been severed by debris. The aircraft had impacted the slope at an angle and attitude consistent with a partially controlled autorotation. The fuselage was largely intact. 11 bodies had been recovered from inside the aircraft, in positions consistent with their having been alive at the moment of impact and having died of subsequent trauma or exposure, or, in the case of the medic Yarber, of shock from an untreated open fracture. Page 7, which is the next surviving page, picks up in the middle of a sentence that reads, and is therefore the conclusion of this investigator, that the loss of the aircraft and the death of the 11 members of the crew and passenger manifest were the result of mechanical failure, and that the survival of the pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Weems, is attributable to his having been thrown clear of the cockpit during the impact sequence and to his subsequent traverse on foot of approximately 4 kilometers of difficult terrain to a point at which he was located by search and rescue elements of the 179th on the morning of the second day. The 11 members of the crew and passenger manifest. 11, not 12. The original casualty list, attached as Annex C to the investigation file, lists 12 names. The body of the report refers consistently to 11 dead. The discrepancy is not addressed anywhere in the surviving pages. The 4 pages that are missing are the pages on which, presumably, it was addressed, or on which it was not addressed, or on which somebody decided that it would not be addressed. Captain Glenn Halsey signed off on the report in May of 1971. He was rotated home in June. He left active duty in 1973. He went to work for Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford, Connecticut, where he stayed for 31 years and where he kept in a locked drawer of his desk at home a single photograph that he had taken with his own Instamatic camera on the slope in Thua Thien Province in the spring of 1970. The photograph showed a place on the slope, approximately 100 meters below the wreckage of the Chinook, where the vegetation had been disturbed in a particular way that Halsey, who had hunted deer in Rhode Island as a boy, recognized as the place where a body had lain for some time and then been moved. He had not been able to make the rest of the recovery team see it. The grave's registration NCO had said it was an animal kill site. The other officer present had said it was nothing. Halsey had taken the photograph anyway, and he had kept it, and on the back of it, in pencil, he had written one word. The word was 12. He never showed the photograph to anyone in the Army. He showed it in 1998 to his son-in-law, who was a state trooper in Connecticut, and his son-in-law had said, "Dad, that's a 30-year-old picture of some leaves." And Halsey had nodded and put the photograph back in the drawer and not spoken of it again. But in 2004, when the JPAC recovery team went back to the site, Captain Glenn Halsey, retired, age 68, called a number he had been given by an old friend at the Pentagon, and he told someone in detail what he had seen on that slope in 1970. And the someone he told it to passed it along to a special agent of the Army Criminal Investigation Division named Marlon Crowder. And Marlon Crowder, 2 weeks later, stood on a porch in Sweet Home, Oregon, with a folder under his arm. But that was still in the future. In 1970, the slope held its silence. The 11 bodies inside the Chinook were photographed and bagged and lifted out by sling load over the course of 2 days, and the wreckage was destroyed in place by a demolition team to deny it to enemy salvage, and the LZ was abandoned, and the monsoon rains came down on it, and the jungle began, in the patient and indifferent way of jungles, to take it back. The 12th man lay where he had fallen, 100 meters down the slope, with a single .45 caliber hole in the back of his skull, and the rains washed over him for 34 years. His name was Glenn Hargrove. He was 22 years old. He had 8 months and 3 days to go. At first light on the morning of the second day, a UH-1D Huey from the search and rescue element of the 179th, flying a creeping line-ahead pattern over a 5 by 5 kilometer search box southwest of Camp Evans, spotted a man in a flight suit walking along the dry bed of a monsoon drainage about 4 kilometers east-southeast of the suspected crash site. The pilot of the Huey was Warrant Officer Jubal Roque. The crew chief was Specialist Ferris Olmsted. They came down low and circled twice, and the man in the flight suit looked up and waved one arm. He was holding the other arm against his chest. They could see, through the binoculars, that his face was streaked with dried blood, and that he was walking the way men walked when they had been walking for a very long time on willpower alone. Roque put the Huey down on a sandbar in the stream bed. Olmsted jumped out with a canteen and a first aid kit and ran to the man and got an arm under his good shoulder and walked him back to the helicopter. The man's name tape said Weems. He said in a voice that Olmsted later described as perfectly clear, considering, "Engine failure, forward transmission. We came down on a slope about 4 clicks west. I was thrown clear. I'm the only one who made it." Olmsted said, "Sir, are you injured?" Weems said, "Collarbone, right side. I can walk." He could walk. He did walk. He walked up the ramp of the Huey under his own power and sat on the troop bench and accepted the canteen and drank from it slowly, the way a man who has been dehydrated for a long time drinks, taking small sips and waiting between them. And he gave Olmsted the grid square he believed the wreckage was on, and he closed his eyes, and he did not open them again until the Huey was on the pad at Camp Eagle, and a medic was waiting with a stretcher. He spent 11 days at the 185th Evacuation Hospital. He was visited there by 2 officers from the safety section of his battalion, by a chaplain, and on one occasion by a major from the Inspector General's office at division. He gave his statement 4 times. The statement was internally consistent on every telling. The aircraft had developed a forward transmission anomaly approximately 6 minutes into the flight. He had elected to attempt a precautionary landing rather than continue to Lima Zulu. The transmission had seized before he could find a clearing. He had brought the aircraft down through the canopy in a controlled auto-rotation. He had been thrown from the cockpit in the impact sequence and had regained consciousness sometime later, approximately 50 meters from the wreckage. He had been unable to locate any other survivors. He had taken a compass bearing toward what he believed to be the nearest friendly position and had walked for approximately 30 hours with rest stops, navigating by terrain and by the position of the sun when visible through the cloud cover. The statement made sense. The statement made sense to the safety officer and to the chaplain, and to the major from the IG, and to Captain Glenn Halsey when he read it in May of 1971, except for one detail that Halsey could not let go of, and that he raised exactly once in a meeting with the battalion commander. The detail was this. Chief Warrant Officer Curtis Weems had walked 4 kilometers through triple canopy jungle in the monsoon with a broken collarbone in 30 hours, and when he had been picked up, he had not been carrying his sidearm. The Colt 1911 that had been issued to him, serial number on file, was not in the holster on his hip when Specialist Olmsted helped him onto the Huey. It was not at the wreckage site when the recovery team got there. It was nowhere on the 4-kilometer line between the wreckage and the stream bed. Halsey, in the meeting, had said, "Sir, where is the pistol?" The battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel named Asbury Crenshaw, had looked at him for a long moment and had said, "Captain, the man walked 4 kilometers with a broken collarbone. He probably dropped it. Are you suggesting something else?" Halsey had said, "No, sir." He had said it because he was a captain and Crenshaw was a lieutenant colonel, and because the war was still on, and because a missing pistol on a closed accident investigation was, in 1971, exactly the kind of question that ended careers and did not produce answers. And he had walked out of the meeting, and he had signed the report, and he had gone home. But he had taken the photograph, and he had written the word on the back of it. And 33 years later, in a den in East Hartford, Connecticut, with a glass of bourbon on the desk in front of him and a phone in his hand, he made a call. Curtis Weems was honorably discharged from the United States Army in the spring of 1971, 8 months after the crash, on a medical determination related to the residual effects of his injuries. The clavicle had healed badly. He could no longer pass a flight physical. He was offered a desk assignment at Fort Rucker, Alabama. He declined. He went home to Bakersfield, California for 6 weeks. He stayed with his mother, who was widowed and ill. He attended, on one occasion, a meeting of a veterans group at a VFW post in town. He did not speak at the meeting. He left before the closing prayer. In the late summer of 1971, he loaded a footlocker and a duffel bag and a typewriter case into the trunk of a 1966 Plymouth Fury, and he drove north up Highway 99 and then up Interstate 5. And he did not stop driving until he reached a small town in the foothills of the Western Cascades in the state of Oregon, a town built around a sawmill on a fork of a river, a town where nobody knew him and nobody was going to know him. He took a room above a hardware store. He got a job at the sawmill on the green chain pulling lumber. He gave his name as Curtis Eldon. He let people assume that Eldon was his last name. Within 2 years, he had legally changed it. The paperwork, filed in a county courthouse in 1973, gave as the reason personal preference. The judge did not ask further. Judges in small Oregon counties in 1973 did not, as a rule, ask further. He worked at the sawmill for 26 years. He bought a small house on a back road outside of town in 1978. He never married. He kept a vegetable garden. He attended a Methodist church on the first Sunday of each month and no other Sunday. He drank, in the evenings, alone, from a bottle of bourbon that he replaced approximately every 3 weeks. He did not, his neighbors would later say, seem unhappy. He did not seem haunted. He seemed, one of them said, like a man who had decided a long time ago that there was a particular thing he was not going to think about, and had not thought about it, and was not going to start. He retired from the sawmill in 1997 at the age of 64 on a small pension. He spent the next 7 years tending the garden and reading library books and walking every afternoon along the river road for approximately 2 miles and back. The package from Pratt & Whitney's Retired Employees newsletter that arrived at Glenn Halsey's house in East Hartford, Connecticut, in the autumn of 2003, contained in its mailing list a piece of news that Halsey almost did not read. He almost did not read it because the news was about the Joint POWMIA Accounting Command and the planned recovery operations for the coming year, and Halsey had stopped reading those notices years ago, because the names did not change and the slopes did not change, and there was nothing he could do about any of it. But that morning, for a reason he could not have said, he read it. And in the list of planned recoveries for 2004, on a page near the back, was the entry for a CH-47 Chinook helicopter crash site at an elevation of approximately 640 meters in what had been Thua Thien Province, Republic of Vietnam, in 1970. 11 sets of remains expected. Halsey read the line 3 times. He put the newsletter down. He went into his den. He opened the locked drawer. He took out the photograph. He looked at it. Then he picked up the telephone. The recovery team that landed on the slope in the spring of 2004 was a JPAC element of 14 people. They were led by an Air Force lieutenant colonel named Verla Chastain. The forensic anthropologist on the team was a civilian named Dr. Ren Pickering of the University of Hawaii. The team also included a representative of the Vietnamese government, a young captain from the Ministry of National Defense who spoke fluent English and who was, Chastain noted in her field journal, scrupulously professional throughout the operation. The team worked the wreckage site for 9 days. They recovered remains and personal effects and identification media. They cataloged everything. They worked in the careful, slow, almost archaeological way that JPAC teams work, because the families of the men they were bringing home had waited a long time and would not be served by haste. On the 7th day, an enlisted member of the team, Staff Sergeant Quinton Velasco, stepped off the wreckage perimeter to relieve himself, and on the way back he tripped on a root and went down to one knee. and as he was getting up, his hand came down on something white in the leaf litter. It was a human rib. Dr. Pickering came down the slope to where Velasco was standing. She looked at the rib. She looked at the slope above and below. She set down her field kit. She began, very carefully, to clear the leaf litter in a 1-meter circle around the rib. By sundown, she had recovered most of a human skeleton. By the morning of the 8th day, she had the skull. The skull had a single entry wound in the occipital bone, low and slightly to the left, with no exit wound. She found the bullet that afternoon, embedded in the soil approximately 6 inches below where the skull had lain. She bagged it and labeled it, and did not, in the field, comment on it. In her hotel room in Hanoi 6 days later, with the bullet on the desk in front of her under a magnifying lamp, she wrote in her field journal a single line. She wrote, "This is not a combat round." The forensic report on the bullet, completed at the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Laboratory at Dover Air Force Base, Delaware, in the late summer of 2004, established the following. The bullet was a .45 caliber automatic Colt pistol round. It was a full metal jacket round of the type manufactured for United States military service issue between approximately 1966 and 1972. The rifling marks on the bullet were consistent with its having been fired from a Colt Model 1911 A1 pistol. The terminal damage to the bullet was consistent with its having struck a thin section of bone at moderate velocity, which was, the report noted, consistent with a shot fired from a distance of less than 3 meters. The skeletal remains were identified through dental records and through a DNA comparison with a maternal relative as those of specialist Glenn Eugene Hargrove of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, born 1948, declared killed in action in the Republic of Vietnam in 1970. The Army Criminal Investigation Division opened a case file in the early autumn of 2004. The case file was assigned to Special Agent Marlon Crowder, 51 years old, of the Fort Belvoir Field Office, with 23 years on the job and a reputation for working old cases with patience. His partner on the case was Special Agent Bethany Voss, 38, formerly of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. They spent 6 weeks reading the surviving fragments of the original investigation file and interviewing, where they could be found, the surviving members of the 179th Assault Support Helicopter Company. They interviewed Captain Glenn Halsey, retired, at his home in East Hartford, and Halsey gave them the photograph and told them what he had seen on the slope in 1970. They interviewed Warrant Officer Jubal Roque, retired, at his home in Beaverton, Oregon, and Roque told them, with apologies, that he could remember nothing about the pickup of Curtis Weems that struck him as unusual at the time, although now, thinking about it, he supposed it had been strange that the man had been so calm. They interviewed the chaplain's son, who showed them his late father's journal, and in the last week of October, they drove a rental car east from Portland on Highway 20 into the foothills of the Cascades to the small town of Sweet Home. What Crowder and Voss had on Curtis Weems on the morning they knocked on his door did not amount to a case that any United States attorney was going to take to a grand jury. They had a missing pistol from 1970. They had a skeleton with a .45 caliber hole in the back of its skull, found 100 meters from a helicopter wreck. They had a photograph of disturbed leaves and a chaplain's journal entry and a maintenance officer's 34-year-old hunch. They had, in 1971 bureaucratic paperwork, a discrepancy between 11 and 12 that a 40-page redaction had been used to paper over. They did not have a confession. They did not have a witness. They did not have a weapon. What they had was a question that they wanted very badly to ask a man face to face. They did not get to ask it. When Curtis Weems closed the door on them on that wet October morning in 2004, he closed it, in a sense, on the case. They left a card. They drove back to Portland. They flew back to Washington. They wrote a memorandum for the file. The memorandum recommended that the matter be held open pending the development of further evidence, and that, in the event of the death of the subject, his residence be examined under such legal authority as was then available. Curtis Weems did not, however, die for another 19 months. In May of 2006, a neighbor on the River Road, a retired schoolteacher named Marvis Otley, noticed that the curtains in the front window of the small house had not been opened in 3 days, and that the morning newspaper had accumulated on the porch, and that there was no smoke from the chimney, although the nights had been cold. She called the county sheriff. A deputy went out. The deputy found Curtis Weems in the chair in his living room, with a glass of bourbon on the table beside him and a book in his lap, dead. The county coroner determined of a pulmonary embolism approximately 72 hours earlier. Special Agent Marlon Crowder was notified by a flag in the system the next morning. He flew to Portland that afternoon. He and Special Agent Voss arrived at the small house on the River Road at 3:45 p.m. on a Wednesday, with a search authorization signed by a federal magistrate in Portland, and with the county sheriff's deputy as a witness. They spent 11 hours in the house. In the bottom drawer of an oak dresser in the back bedroom, beneath a folded American flag and a set of dog tags and a faded photograph of a young man in a flight suit standing in front of a Chinook, they found a Colt Model 1911 A1 pistol, serial number matching the weapon issued to Chief Warrant Officer Curtis Eldon Weems by the United States Army in February of 1969. Beneath the pistol, folded into thirds, was a single sheet of yellowed notebook paper. On the paper, in pencil, in handwriting that the document examiner would later confirm to be that of Curtis Weems, were 3 lines. The first line was a date. It read, the 7th of April, 1970. This was 3 days before the crash. The second line was a name. The name was not Glenn Hargrove. The name was the name of an officer who had been, in April of 1970, a major in the staff section of a brigade headquarters at Camp Evans, and whose name has been redacted from the version of the document that was eventually released to the public after a Freedom of Information Act request, and whose name will not be reproduced here because the man in question is still living, and because what the third line of the document said about him cannot, at this distance, be proven. The third line was a sentence. The sentence read, "He told me which one of them was going to talk, and he told me what to do about it." This is what the file shows. In the spring of 1970, 3 days before the crash, somebody at Camp Evans told Curtis Weems that one of the men who was going to be on his next manifest to Lima, Zulu, was going to talk. To whom, about what, the file does not say, because Curtis Weems did not write it down, because Curtis Weems wrote down only what he needed to remember and trusted himself to remember the rest. What had Glenn Hargrove seen or heard or done in the 4 months that he had been in country with Fox Company? What was he going to talk about? To whom was he going to talk? The investigators in 2004 developed 3 theories. One theory involved a black market in helicopter parts that had been the subject of a separate, inconclusive CID investigation in 1971. Another involved the misuse of medevac flights for the transport of contraband. The third theory, which Special Agent Crowder personally favored but never committed to paper, involved an incident in a hamlet in the lowlands in February of 1970, in which an unspecified number of unarmed civilians had been killed by elements of the 25th Infantry Division, and the report of which had been, somewhere in the chain, made to disappear. None of the 3 theories was ever proven. What was proven was this: Curtis Weems flew his Chinook on the morning in question, knowing that the forward transmission had a problem that he had elected not to log. Whether he believed the problem would result in catastrophic failure, or whether he believed it would result in a forced landing in remote terrain that would provide him with an opportunity, the file does not say. What he did, when the aircraft came down, was go aft into the cargo bay, identify the man whose name he had been given, and follow that man down a slope in the rain with a Colt 1911 in his hand. What he did 100 meters down that slope, at a moment when the only other living human being within 2 kilometers was a dying medic working on a dying platoon sergeant inside the wreckage of the helicopter, can be inferred from the physical evidence and from a piece of yellowed notebook paper found in a dresser drawer in Sweet Home, Oregon. What he did not do was finish the job. He did not return and shoot the medic and the 2 other living men in the cargo bay. He did not fire a second round into the back of Glenn Hargrove's head to be sure. He left the Colt in his holster, and he left the slope, and he walked 4 kilometers in the rain with a broken collarbone, and at some point in those 30 hours he stopped, and he took the pistol out of the holster, and he wrapped it in his flight gloves, and he buried it. Where, he never said. How he retrieved it later, the file does not establish. That he retrieved it was proven on the night of the search of the house in Sweet Home, when it was lifted from a dresser drawer beneath a folded flag by a special agent of the Criminal Investigation Division wearing latex gloves. Was the commanding officer who told Curtis Weems what was going to be said and what to do about it the man whose career was protected by the silence that followed? Was Curtis Weems a murderer? Was he a soldier who carried out an order that should never have been given? Was he a man who did a terrible thing for what he believed to be a reason, and then spent 34 years in a small house on a back road in Oregon trying to decide whether the reason had been good enough? The file does not say. The file is, in this matter, like most files. It tells what can be proven and is silent on what cannot. The 11 men of Fox Company who died inside the wreckage of CH-47B, tail number 89143267 on the morning in question, are buried in 11 cemeteries in 11 states. Their families were notified in 1970 by Western Union telegrams and by chaplains in Class A uniforms knocking on doors. The 12th man, Specialist Glenn Eugene Hargrove of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, came home in a flag-draped transfer case in the autumn of 2004 and was buried in the Linwood Cemetery on a Saturday morning in October, with full military honors and with a folded flag presented to a younger sister, the only one of his immediate family still living, who took the flag and held it in her lap and said nothing. The man who closed the door in Sweet Home in 2004 was buried in the spring of 2006 in a small cemetery behind a Methodist church on a hillside, with no military honors, by his own request, recorded in a will filed at the county courthouse. His grave is marked with a flat stone that bears a name that was not the name he was born with and a single date. The file remains open. The special agent who carried it, Marlon Crowder, retired from the Criminal Investigation Division in 2011. He kept a copy of the photograph that Glenn Halsey had taken on the slope in 1970. He kept it in a desk drawer in his house in Northern Virginia. He took it out sometimes on long evenings, and he looked at it. And he thought about the question that he had not been allowed to ask, and about the one sentence that Curtis Weems had said to him on a porch in Oregon before closing the door. The sentence was this: "You boys are about 30 years late, but I always knew somebody would come, and there is nothing on this earth that is going to make me say the rest of it out loud." The rest of it. Crowder, in his retirement, came to believe that the rest of it was not, in fact, a confession. It was a name. The name on the second line of the piece of yellowed notebook paper. The name of the man at Camp Evans in the spring of 1970 who had told Curtis Weems which one of them was going to talk and what to do about it. That man, when Crowder retired in 2011, was 83 years old. He was still living. He is, as of the writing of this account, still living. Crowder has not, to date, knocked on his door. Whether he ever will is not, any longer, a question that the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division is in a position to answer. It is a question for one man on long evenings in a house in Northern Virginia, with a photograph of a slope in Thua Thien Province open on the desk in front of him, looking at a place in the leaves where a body once lay. He has not yet decided.